So I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Trayvon Martin, the first casualty, the latest, not the first, the latest casualty of the new Jim Crow. The most recent example of an unarmed young African-American male being killed in cold blood for no other reason than he's black. Maybe that he was wearing a hoodie. Did you hear the 911 tape that was released just this week about this incident in this town in Florida, Sanford, where Trayvon Martin was killed last month? The shooter was a vigilante, neighborhood watchman who is not supposed to be armed and who the police specifically instructed on that phone call not to pursue the young man. Here's what the shooter said when he saw Trayvon, who was a 17-year-old student, who went to the 7-Eleven to buy his little stepbrother a bag of Skittles during the halftime of the All-Star basketball game that they were watching together in their home. To the 911 dispatcher, he said, when he saw Trayvon, "This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining and he's just walking around, looking about. He's got his hand in his waistband. And he's a black male and something's wrong with him. He's got something in his hands. I don't know what his deal is, but these a-holes, they always get away." I'm editing the language just a little bit. The 911 dispatcher tells the watchman to stay in his car, but he gets out of his car and he follows the boy, whose teachers say is an A and B student who majors in cheerfulness, an athlete who was walking through a gated community where his stepmother lives, carrying a package of candy and an Arizona iced tea. Now he's dead. A case of walking while black. We have to stop thinking of these tragedies as isolated incidents like Sean Bell from Queens, New York, Oscar Grant from Oakland, California, Amadeo Diallo from the Bronx, and realize that there is a new Jim Crow system alive and well in this country when young, unarmed black males can be gunned down and nobody is made to take responsibility for it. The problem is that we've been eating Jim Crow for so long, we don't even realize it anymore. I'm told that there was a time in this country when people ground horse meat and pawned it off as beef and fooled a lot of people. Well, we've been eating the new Jim Crow for so long, we think we're eating Kentucky Fried Chicken. A proud American tradition. We're in church this morning because we believe that everybody is a child of God and deserves the chance to be free. In fact, we've created a nation founded on this idea, but we have failed yet to live up to it. And yet, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Amen. The old Jim Crow was created to make it illegal for white and black people to come together as equals. And it kept us from organizing together and thus served the purpose of ending a populist movement in the 19th century that threatened the economic status quo that made few rich and kept most poor. Did you know that the very first act of the Oklahoma legislature, in its very first session, when Oklahoma became a state, their first act was to enact Jim Crow laws? That's the state we're in. That's the state of things that we're in. The new Jim Crow that I'm talking about today keeps white and black people separated by fear of one another, by painting black folks as a group as violent, immoral, crime-ridden, and dangerous, particularly the young males. That's how Trayvon Martin ended up dead. His killer saw what our society taught him to see in a young black male, a criminal. If I told you that there are more African Americans in prison right now than were enslaved during slavery in this country before the Civil War, would you agree that there's a problem? All right. What if I said that a third of all young African American males in this country are either behind bars, on probation, or otherwise caught up in the criminal justice system? And that in some urban centers, more than 80% of the young African American males are either in jail, on parole, or otherwise in this system. Do you know that in our nation's capital, it is said that 3 out of every 4 young black males are expected to serve time in prison? That's our capital. No other country on earth imprisons such a huge proportion of their minority population. Not even South Africa at the height of the apartheid regime. There are only 2 possible explanations. Either you believe African Americans are significantly more immoral and criminally inclined than people of other ethnic groups, or there is something seriously wrong with our criminal justice system. Seriously wrong. In other words, there's only one explanation. Right? In the next few minutes, I'm going to explain not only that there's something seriously wrong with our criminal justice system, but how it developed, how it works, and what you and I can do about it. If you want to know why I'm talking about this in church, it's because this month we're focusing on the theme of brokenness. And this system is broken, and it's breaking a lot of people's lives. And our religion teaches us to love our neighbors as ourselves, and our young black and brown neighbors are being rounded up by the millions and imprisoned for things that get all but ignored when they happen in white parts of town. Stay with me here. These young Americans are being shuttled from underfunded and crumbling schools into new high-tech prisons. How is it that decades of research demonstrates that people of all ethnicities, races, and socioeconomic levels use and sell drugs at about the same rate? And yet in some places in America, 90% of those arrested for drug crimes are people of color. It doesn't add up unless you look closely at how it works. Much of this information comes from a book titled The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness by Michelle Alexander, who is a law professor at Ohio State University. It is one of the most important books on race in America to be written in a generation. So get it, read it, buy it. It is very important. The reason that she calls it the new Jim Crow is because once you get caught up in the criminal justice system, this system incarcerates an unbelievably disproportionate number of black and brown Americans, right? At a grossly disproportionate rate. And once you get caught up in this system and are labeled a felon, suddenly many of the forms of discrimination that were supposedly outlawed during the civil rights era and the end of Jim Crow become legal again. A person loses their right to vote, also loses their right to serve on a jury, and then they can now be legally discriminated against for jobs, housing, education, and public service for the rest of their lives, legally, in America. Now, if someone were to have devised a system of racial control to replace Jim Crow that legally disenfranchises a huge segment of the African American community from American society, they could not have come up with a more efficient system than our current criminal justice system. And specifically the war on drugs and the way that it's being waged. But don't take my word for it. Let me explain. Let me walk you through how it happens. It began as part of the Southern strategy of the Republican Party that went into full swing after legal segregation was outlawed in the 1960s. Now, before the Democrats get too self-righteous here. They're going to jump right in, pile on, when it becomes politically expedient as well. But it began with Republican politicians using get tough on crime appeals as a way to gain the support, especially of Southern working class and poor whites, who were so disturbed and anxious about the new dynamics that put African Americans in equal competition with them for jobs, housing, and education. Wealthy white people could move to the suburbs, which they did in record numbers, and could afford private schooling for their children, and were nowhere near as threatened in their professional level jobs. Whereas poor and working class whites in the South experienced what felt like a social demotion. They were now competing with and sharing schools and jobs and resources with people who they had been taught from childhood were inferior to them. Republicans saw this as an enormous political opportunity to make gains in the South, which until that time was dominated by the Democratic Party. As the Democratic Party became associated with civil rights, the Republican Party found ways to appeal to white Southerners with coded messages about being tough on crime, which was a thinly veiled and easily understood racial reference. But believe me, Democratic politicians began to do the same thing when it became opportunistic for them as well. In fact, Bill Clinton became one of the greatest reinforcers of this system. And President Obama, it's a great disappointment, has maintained this system at the same level as President Bush. He's done a couple things. He stopped calling it a war on drugs. He said we shouldn't be at war with our own people. So that's a good step, but mostly semantics. And he changed one of the laws from the 1 to 100 rule between crack and powder cocaine to 1 to 18 rule. We'll talk about that in a minute. But nobody's hands are clean on this deal. And that's why it's going to take all of us to work together to dismantle it. It gained its first traction when Reagan called the war on drugs in the 80s. But get this, at the time that he waged this supposed war on drugs, there were only 300,000 people total in all of the prisons in the United States. And today there are over 2 million people. That's not a doubling or a tripling or a quadrupling. That is a septupling of the prison population. That is 700% increase in the prison population in 30 years, in most of our lifetimes. This is unheard of in human history, to see such an unprecedented rise in incarceration. There is no other country on earth that imprisons so many of its own people. Do you know that when the war on drugs was waged, there were only 41,000 Americans in prison for drug crimes? Today there are 500,000. Now many people think that the war on drugs was a response to crack cocaine coming into America, but nothing could be further from the truth. When the drug war was first announced back in 1982, crack barely existed in America, and drug use was actually on a 2-year decline in this country. The war on drugs was not a response to increased drug use. But yet, 3 years after the drug war was announced, crack and powder cocaine were everywhere in the United States. Some of you remember that. What happened in those years? The CIA has now admitted publicly that they allowed drug runners from Central America free access to the United States as long as they were running weapons and money to the guerrillas in Nicaragua. It was an illegal and covert operation to fund terrorists carried out by the executive branch of the government during the Reagan administration, and it became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Suddenly, cocaine was everywhere, and political speeches and the media were flooded with images of black crack whores and black crack babies. These images perpetuated the worst racial stereotypes in our nation. These images were used by the administration to advocate for increased funding for the FBI anti-drug efforts, and the Department of Defense anti-drug funding went from $33 million to over $1 billion. And at the same time, the administration slashed the funding for drug abuse and rehabilitation programs by 500%. What happens when law enforcement of drugs goes way up and money for rehabilitation goes way down? Lots of money goes into new high-tech prisons in order to meet the enormous demand for locking up American citizens at a rate unparalleled in the Western world or anywhere in the world. At the same time, mandatory sentencing for drug crimes was enacted and punished crack cocaine, which was popular in poorer communities of color, and they penalized it 100 times to 1 harsher than powder cocaine. Right? It's almost the exact same chemical makeup, but powder cocaine is more expensive and is abused mostly by white, middle class, and upper class Americans. 100 to 1. That means a person with as little as 5 grams of crack, which can fit in your pocket and get a few people high, would receive 5 years in prison, mandatory sentence, first time being caught. And it would take 500 grams of powder cocaine to receive the same sentence. That's a pound of powder cocaine. That could keep this whole church high for a couple of days. At first, local and state law enforcement wanted to have nothing to do with Reagan's war on drugs. They refused to participate, preferring to use their resources to fight serious crimes like rape, murder, and theft that had actual victims. In order to get local law enforcement interested, the Reagan administration began to offer huge grants for pursuing drug convictions. And then local law enforcement was given the right to retain most of the cash and property that was confiscated as part of a drug arrest. Suddenly, the war on drugs became a major source of financing for local police departments around the country. There was a financial incentive in every drug bust. So who was targeted? Who do you think? The low-hanging fruit. Did the police go and shake down suburban high school kids or private school kids who were using and dealing marijuana, cocaine, ecstasy, and other drugs at rates comparable to, and in many cases more than, the kids of color? No way. Did they go to the fraternity houses on college campuses or try to police the use of prescription drugs and marijuana and powder cocaine by housewives and politicians and business people across America? Heck no. They went into the poorest neighborhoods, as they still do today, and they bust mostly small-time drug users and petty drug dealers. Of these millions of people who have been arrested for drug crimes in America, 4 out of 5 are for possession, and only 1 out of 5 are for dealing. And a vast majority are for marijuana. And most of the people arrested have no history of violence. I'm going to tell you a true story in just a second. Something that happened in the last few weeks right here in Tulsa. But first, I want to make it very clear that, I want to let you know that for the last 4 years, I've been a mayoral appointee to the Mayor and Police Community Action Coalition. So I meet every month with the chief of police and a number of police officers and other community representatives from the NAACP and other community groups around this city. And we discuss law enforcement in our city. And as part of that coalition, I know a lot of Tulsa police officers on a first-name basis, and I've ridden along with officers on their beats in both South and North Tulsa. So before I share this story, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying this is an issue of bad cops. That's too easy, and it misses the real problem. There can be bad apples in law enforcement just like there are bad apples in every single profession there is, everywhere. But to think that bad officers are the problem here is to miss the point. I respect the Tulsa Police Department highly, and these officers put their lives on their line in our community daily and do not get paid nearly enough for the risks that they take for our public safety. In fact, 3 weeks ago, I was riding along with the officer who was the first respondent to the shooting that happened outside of the courthouse. Moments earlier, we were sitting in his patrol car and we're talking about exchanging stories about our kids and our families. And next thing I know, he's running into a gunfight. These are incredible officers who put their lives on the line to protect the public safety, people they don't know, and are trying to do it, most of them, for absolutely the right reason. So to locate this problem there is too simplistic, and it's a big mistake. But what I'm going to describe to you happened in Tulsa a few weeks ago. It happens every day in Tulsa and all over this country, and it's perfectly legal according to the Supreme Court, even though it's unbelievably unethical. My colleague was riding along with a Tulsa police officer, and they stopped perpendicular to a stop sign in North Tulsa. And the officer explained that almost everyone rolls past, a little bit past the stop sign before they stop, or they don't come to a full stop. He said, we'll just wait here for a little while and see when somebody we think is up to no good, then we'll pull them over and we'll check them out if they don't stop properly. They sat and watched a half a dozen people roll through the stop sign, making moving violations, until the officer saw one that he wanted to check out. The first person happened to be a Caucasian, and he did not have any illegal drugs or paraphernalia in his car and was let go with a verbal warning. The next person he decided to stop was Hispanic, and the officer found a bag with 25 grams of marijuana in his car, a little less than an ounce, and the young man was arrested. Later, at that same spot, 2 African-American young males came driving up in an old car, and the officer said, I bet they're up to something, but they stopped properly at the sign. So he said, that's okay, let's follow them around for a while until they make a mistake. It's perfectly legal. That's the system we're talking about. They proceeded to follow them until these 2 young men pulled into a restaurant and went in, and there was nothing they could do, so they moved on. The fact is that every time we drive, you and I make some moving violations. We don't put our blinker on at the right distance from the intersection, or we don't put our blinker on before we change lanes. But I guarantee you, if the police were sitting at a stop sign here in well-to-do Maple Ridge, or any number of well-off neighborhoods in this city, and arresting teenagers and moms and dads and others for possession of drugs, it would not last a week before people would rise up and protest against this practice and this violation of people's privacy and civil liberties. But that's not because people in this part of town are doing any less drugs than people on the north side of town. It's because people here, there's so many lawyers and professionals, and the police know they would protest it, take it to court, and this practice would end in no time flat. So where do they go? They go where there's low-hanging fruit. Can you imagine the police shaking down white suburban kids getting off their buses after school in this country? It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. But it happens in Black and Hispanic poor neighborhoods all over the United States. It wouldn't last long if it happened here. The point is that people of color in America are being arrested for crimes that are largely ignored when committed by white Americans. And then this high rate of incarceration contributes to the image that young black males are criminals, and it leads to tragedies like the killing of innocent young people like Tavon Martin, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, and the list goes on and on. Way too many others. What happens to those who do get caught up in the system is that once they're arrested, most of these young people of color lose many of their rights as citizens for the rest of their lives. Right? 90%, get this, 90% of the convictions go to plea bargain. So these young people never get their day in court. Why is that? As a matter of fact, a number of them who are not guilty plead guilty anyway to take the plea bargain. And you'd ask, why would somebody do that? Well, because the mandatory sentencing is so severe for these crimes that they're forced to decide, usually in a matter of minutes or hours under very stressful circumstances and often with very poor, if any, legal representation, whether they want to risk a jury possibly finding them guilty and being sent to 5 or 15 years in prison, or to be free the same day. and to walk away on probation by admitting to a felony. For many of these young people of color, the idea of proving their innocence in the courts is scary. Their faith in the justice system is not high, and the possibility of landing in jail for a huge portion of their lives is real. So they take the plea, even some who are not guilty. The police say that the reason that they target these neighborhoods is because that's where there's a lot of violence, and the residents have contacted them and asked them to clean it up. However, according to what I've read, their practice actually increases the violence. It doesn't do anything to stop it. Here's why. When they bust a dealer, it's usually a small-time street dealer, and it's almost never a big kingpin, right? And there are 10 other dealers waiting right there to take over that job, and that's what happens. And what happens is these dealers and the drugs start a turf war over this new turf that's now available, and so it becomes even more violent in these communities. The residents say, clean up the violence. What they're not saying is create a situation that perpetrates the violence. So Harvard professor William Julius Wilson, he did an extensive, well-documented study that shows that violent crime in this country actually correlates with joblessness and not race or drugs. In other words, violent crime is prevalent in white communities at the same level, with the same level of joblessness as it is in Black and Hispanic communities. So since violent crime, get this, is linked with joblessness, this system which incarcerates and convicts huge percentages of Black and brown people, thus makes it extremely hard for them to find employment after being arrested and convicted. It actually exasperates the level of violent crime in these communities. It doesn't stop it. When a person comes out of prison, they have to check a box on job applications, on applications for education, and it's like having the mark of Cain on your forehead for the rest of your life. It becomes an invisible set of jail walls around these young people and people of all ages who are disproportionately Black and brown in this system. And it keeps them out of the mainstream of society, a permanent underclass. Keep in mind that many are being arrested and thrust into this system for the same nonviolent offenses that are largely ignored when committed by white people. And most who go to prison have huge debts to pay upon their release, right? They have large court fees or fines, or some states make them pay for their incarceration or make them pay for their drug tests throughout their probationary period, and many have unpaid child support from their time away. So if they find a job at all, they can have their wages garnished until they've paid off all their debts. That's hardly an incentive to get back into the legal workforce, if you can even find a job. Checking off felon, being a Black male and trying to get a job, it's not easy. Many people end up back in prison in a chronic cycle of detention and release, a permanent underclass in American minorities that begins mostly with teenage indiscretion for simple possession of drugs. Now, we all make mistakes and bad choices, especially as teenagers. It doesn't matter what your background is. But if you grow up in some parts of town rather than others, that same mistake can cost you your life. If the billions of dollars a year that are put into arresting and incarcerating millions of Americans for drug crimes were spent on creating jobs, providing work training, or offering drug rehabilitation efforts, research shows that there would be a lot less violence in this city and in this country. The war on drugs has been a complete failure in trying to reduce the use and abuse of drugs in this country, and it is, in essence, has created a new legal system of racial control and oppression in this country. Now, when are we going to admit that drugs is a public health issue, not a crime? We have to decide what kind of nation we want to be. As Dr. Alexander says, there is a human rights nightmare occurring on our watch. We need to do much more than have bursts of outrage and protest around isolated incidents of injustice like the death of Trayvon Martin. We need to awaken a sustained mass movement of the American people similar to the civil rights movement if there's going to be any significant change. Do you realize that in order to return this country back to the level of incarceration prior to the onslaught of the war on drugs, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people in prison today? That's a tall order. But plus, it would require shutting down hundreds of prisons in rural communities all over this country, including Oklahoma. And this is often the only source of revenue and jobs in these communities. Over 1 million people would lose their jobs, and private companies that manage prisons who have their stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange would see their profits dry up. This is not a simple problem, but it is our problem. Because it is a disgrace to our nation, a failure of our democracy, and it is a perpetuation of this nation's long history of racial inequality and control. We went from subjugation, slavery, to subordination, Jim Crow, to incarceration. The statistics are undeniable, even as the problem is invisible to many middle class and upper class Americans. Because it happens in isolated, poor, urban communities and in these rural towns that have the prisons. We need to awaken the conscience of the nation until there is a new focus on drug rehabilitation and not criminalization. We need to join hands to put an end to privatized prisons. Do you know that? All right. Get this. Last year, the Corrections Corporation of America sent letters to 48 states offering to take over their public prisons. They said that they could save the states money, but there was one catch. The catch is that they said the governments would have to sign a 20-year contract and guarantee them 90% occupancy rates or higher. Can you imagine? Talk about unethical. Guaranteed rate of occupancy for the prisons. We need to join together to develop better options for education so that American schools are high-tech and well-staffed, not American prisons. We need to join hands to create jobs for the urban poor because we have evidence that there's a correlation between joblessness and violence. And we need to join hands to create sentencing reform because drunk drivers who kill people every day in this nation get 1 to 2 days mandatory jail time for their first offense and a misdemeanor on their record, while someone possessing crack for personal use gets 5 years in prison and a felony for the first time. We need to at least decriminalize marijuana and possibly other drugs so that smoking marijuana, which is arguably less dangerous than alcohol or cigarettes, stops landing people in prison and as permanent outcasts from mainstream society. We need to come together, black, brown, white, every color in the rainbow, and not allow any system to control us or keep us from working together, organizing together, living together as human beings. And church is not just about healing the brokenness in our personal lives. Church is not just about dressing up and celebrating holidays. Church is about binding up the brokenness in the world. It's about answering the question, who is my neighbor, and learning each week to include one more person in that circle. The Bible says, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and free the prisoner. Jesus said, what you have done unto the least of these, you have done unto me. I guarantee you that young black and brown people are not engaging in more drug crimes, but they are being grossly over-penalized and discriminated against by our system. Knowing this, the question is, will you and I turn away? Let's not turn away. God bless you. Amen.